As we learn about research methods, one thing I did was design a few mnemonic devices, some words where the letters represent other terms or concepts to help chunk information together. When you're doing quality research design, there are definitely a few things that you have to build into your study to make sure that it's going to avoid some of the pitfalls that have plagued research in the past. The mnemonic device I use for sort of your checklist for quality design is Brothers. It's sort of a hokey little thing here, right? But the idea is that your brothers always have your back, and if you account for all the brothers, then your study should be well designed, and we'll see how this goes. Okay, so the first B in Brothers stands for basis of comparison. All studies have to have something that they're being compared to. A lot of times, studies will have two different groups of individuals that they'll compare. That's one way to get a basis of comparison. Sometimes you might compare one group of students from a certain year versus students from another year. You may decide to use gender as your basis of comparison, comparing females and males. Sometimes the basis of comparison can just be past research on a project. So you could do some research and then say, this is sort of how this phenomenon has worked out in the past, and now I want to see how it's working out with this other population today, now. But you need to have something that you're comparing your current research with. One of the things you always want to avoid, or one of the things you always want to account for, is to make sure that there isn't something, at chance with the results of your study. So, for example, if you just did a study once and you had no basis of comparison, it could just happen to be that on that day with that group of people, the findings worked out in a way that either affirmed or sort of caused you to reject your hypothesis. So you always want to have some basis of comparison. The next letter in Brothers, of course, is the R, replication. This is accounting for the same issue, where you want to make sure that it wasn't just a chance happening that you got the results that you got. And so to do that, you need to repeat your study over and over and over and over again, and then check to ensure that you're getting some consistent results. Replication is difficult. Obviously, it's time consuming. For our class studies, we're really going to have a limited amount of time. So replication, even though you should build it into your design, is definitely something that we're probably not going to be able to accomplish to the degree that we would really need to. Right, so replication is important, but I recognize and we can recognize that it's probably not going to work out exactly the way that we would want it to for our studies. Operational definitions. This was covered definitely in your summer reading. You need to define all of the variables that you're studying. If I was studying, if I had a hypothesis that hot classrooms cause poor student performance, there's some operational definitions that need to be defined before I can go about that study. So if you think about it, why don't you write down a couple of the definitions, a couple of the variables that would need to be defined, and try to define them. And I think if you do that, you get a sense as to just how precise and how thoughtful you have to be in the design of your study. So operational definitions are extremely important. One of the things that has to be operationally defined pretty early in your study is the target population. The target population is the group that you're actually interested in learning about, or the segment of the population that you're interested in learning about. For our purposes, the target population is going to need to be fairly narrow. Studies have been done to look at the opinions of high school seniors. Well, we could never use a target population that broad because we don't have access to all high school seniors across the country. We could redefine our target population as Needham High School seniors. That's a population that's manageable for us. That's a population we have access to. And you have to sort of be thoughtful about defining your target population, and ours are going to end up being fairly narrow. So consider that as we talk about potential research studies and research proposals. The other key element of your research design is you need to have a good measure of the variables that you're trying to study. You want to be able to accurately gauge each variable. And so the technique that you use to collect data should fit with the actual variables that you're trying to measure. So if we went back to that one about hot classrooms, right? If I said hot classrooms are going to be defined as classrooms over 80 degrees. That's all well and good. How am I gauging the 80 degrees? Do I have an accurate way of actually measuring that? That's a simple one. That's probably an easy one to measure. But as we come up with more complicated hypotheses and research topics, I think you'll find that it gets more and more difficult. The H stands for hypothesis. The hypothesis, the key thing to remember here is your hypothesis has to match the conclusion. Or really, I suppose, a better way of saying this, but it doesn't work out for brothers, is that the conclusion has to match the hypothesis. Be very, very careful. When you decide to look over your results and decide to definitively decide whether or not the hypothesis is accepted or rejected, you can only accept what you actually designed the study to look into. So if I was looking at warm classrooms and student performance, and I did all this data and I found out that kids seem to perform just as well in classrooms that were 80 degrees as they did when classrooms were at 72 degrees. I don't then say that I conclude that temperature has no effect on student performance, because that's not what the study was designed to do, and that's not what my hypothesis said. All I can do is simply reject the hypothesis that hot classrooms will impact student performance. It's a slight thing, but it ends up having a profound effect on what studies are saying about human behavior. And I think we'll notice that more as you design your own studies. Ethics, we've talked about this. We have our 4 or 5 ethical guidelines, and you have to specifically account for all of the guidelines with regards to your study in the methods section of your write-up. The R, very important. Once you have your target population, you need to create a random sample of that target population. And the sample is really the number of, the group of individuals who will actually participate in your study. So let's say that our target population was Needham High School seniors. Well, that's still a very broad group. And it's highly unlikely that you're going to have the opportunity to have every single senior participate in your study. So you need a sample of that target population. But what you want to do is make sure that the sample is actually representing the entire group. And the best way to do that is to try to achieve a true random sample, which is very difficult to do. A true random sample, by definition, means that every single individual in the target population had an equal opportunity to participate in the study. And there's a lot of difficulty in actually achieving that goal. A lot of times students think if they design the sample selection process in sort of a random way, that it's a random sample. That's not true. You got to be very careful. Kids will say, oh yeah, well, I just grabbed anybody I could find and it was totally random and I had no reason to grab some people versus other people, so that's a true random sample. Well, probably not likely. It depends how exactly you did that. More on that later. The S stands for sample selection, and again, that sort of speaks with the true random samples that I mentioned in R, and also the target population in T, but the sample selection process is really important. The other element of S is standardization. You really need all of the procedures of your study to be standardized. It should be the same for everyone. If you are giggling when you go and ask somebody to participate in your study in one case versus being serious in another, it's going to skew the data. And that's something that you have to account for, and that's something that you should right into the research design exactly the procedures of how you're going to engage people in your study. Now, beyond the research design, beyond using brothers, there are other intervening variables, or confounding variables as they're sometimes called, that can be at play, things that you didn't account for. If you're asking people about their dating habits and it's a Friday, they may have dates all set up and have very clear ideas. If you ask them on a Tuesday, it could skew the data. Maybe individuals, aren't really clear on their dating habits on Tuesday. Little things like this can end up skewing the overall results of the data that you are then scrutinizing and analyzing and including as part of your study. So you want to be very careful, and you want to heighten your awareness of the potential for confounding variables and make sure that you're noting them, because you need to address them as you do your write-up of your study. Additionally, of course, there's also biases, natural biases that are difficult for us to account for, that you want to at least be aware of, try to account for, and then recognize when they were at play in your study as you look over your data. Some of the most important ones to be mindful of, I've written down here: the Hawthorne effect, sometimes called the subject expectancy effect. The Hawthorne effect says that if the individual knows that they're being watched or knows what they're being asked to do, they tend to want to please the researcher, and so as a result, they skew their performance or change their behavior. The Rosenthal effect is just the opposite. That's when the researcher sort of wants their study to be correct. We all want to be right at times, and as a result, we inadvertently build in either questions or we build in procedures that are increasing the likelihood that we're going to find data that affirms our hypothesis, and so we have to be cautious of that. Barnum effect, like P.T. Barnum and Barnum and Bailey's circus. The idea of the circus often has illusions and often does things in such a way that it has a great effect on individuals' perceptions of things. What you want to be careful of with the Barnum effect is that you're not looking at data that is very broad and very wide in scope and then making very specific conclusions about it. So you have to be very, very cautious of what you really have for data and what you can say about that data. And then finally, the hindsight bias, was also included in the summer reading. And that's, again, the idea that we tend to think that the results of our study are common sense, and we tend to think that things are obvious. But until you actually have the data to back it up, you really can't say too much about the results of your study. Okay, with that, we'll stop here, and we should be ready to scrutinize some studies based on applying the brothers and the research biases. So let's try to do that in class.